All right, so we're a little bit behind, but we're going to go ahead and get started. And as I just mentioned to the fellows that are here today, this morning with us, that we will start on aquatic plants today, and we'll start with first a presentation by Natalie. And I just want to recognize, and I think she will too, that a lot of the information in this presentation was provided by Dennis Hanasak, who is, of course, with Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute at Florida Atlantic University. And then from there, Brandon McLean is agreed to tour his farm, Florida Aquatic Nurseries, and I think he's on board already with us. So that will probably be within 20-25 minutes. So we're going to start with this presentation, and Natalie.
All right, hi everyone. My name is Natalie, and today we're going to be talking about freshwater plant aquaculture. I'm going to be talking to you guys a little bit about some of your experience, maybe going through lakes and ponds and seeing some of the aquatic plants you might see when you're out boating, type of thing. And then I also want to talk to you guys a little bit about your aquaponics system later on. So we just went over our schedule. So again, today we're doing aquatic plant aquaculture. Next week we'll be doing the regulations and leasing process, and then we'll have food fish culture, ornamental fish culture, and lastly, alligator reptile culture. Again, this presentation has been modified by Dennis Hanasak, who's from Harbor Branch, Florida Atlantic University. So today we'll be discussing the uses of freshwater plants, some of the current cultivation methods that are used here in Florida, and Brandon McLean will actually be going over some of that as well when you tour his facility. And then we'll be discussing some of the future applications here in Florida that plants could be used for. So I wanted to talk to you guys. What are some reasons you think we would want to be culturing freshwater plants? No idea? Well, what are some of the reasons we plant agriculture here in Florida? Why do we even have agriculture, and why might we want to move to feed people? Yeah. For looks, ornamental stuff, yeah. So some of those same reasons are what we do aquatic plant aquaculture for. So in Florida, the industry began in the 1930s, and aquatic plants have been produced for aquariums. So you want to make your aquariums look very pretty, not only with the fish that you're using, but also the plants. You might have water gardens as well, so outside gardens that have the different ornamental plants. They're very colorful. Food as well, so not only for human consumption, but also for animal consumption, and then wetland restoration. And here in Florida, the industry is primarily in central and southern parts of the state. So Florida actually had a $17.6 million industry in 2005. And that's when we include things like the water gardens, aquariums, wetlands, restorations, and then food markets. So looking at things like producing watercress, which is a food source. And this took about 23.4% of all Florida aquaculture sales in 2005. And if we actually look from 1989, we can see that aquatic plants have grown in cultivation and in sales. You can see that there is a drop though from 2003 and 2005. If we look at 2005 compared to 2012 though, and we take out any type of food market crop like watercress, so then we're only looking at aquarium plants, water garden type plants, and wetland restoration, you can see that in 2005, we had a $8 million industry, and then we dropped down in 2012 to a $5 million industry. But you can see that we have had farms increase. So in 2005, there was 17 farms, and in 2012, we have 19 farms now.
Let me interrupt. So that might be a good question later on for Brandon to better understand why there might have been a drop in value of sales and what he thinks the outlook is today for aquatic plant cultivation.
Correct.
What is a live farm? It's like, it's in aquariums for like coral and everything. It basically has, like Mr. Powers, we have bioballs. That's basically what that is for saltwater aquariums.
And then we'll talk actually about live rock in the ornamental fish culture section as well. So I want to go through some of the permitting issues. We're not going to go in a whole lot of depth though, but we have the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, which is FDACS. And there's two divisions, which are the Division of Aquaculture and the Division of Plant Industry that regulates aquatic plant culture. And so the Division of Plant Industry is actually regulating the horticulture sector. So that's any plants that are being propagated and any plants that are being imported and exported out of the state. That's what the DPI is going to be looking at. And so if you're interested in actually culturing plants in a nursery, you're going to need to get an aquaculture certificate of registration and then a certificate for your nursery. There are also some classifications that you have to know. So if you're looking at growing certain plants, you need to see if that plant falls into different classes. And so we have a class 1 plant and a class 2 plant. So here's a list of the class 1 plants. And that means that you're not permitted to possess, collect, transport, cultivate, or import these plants, except under this specific rule. So you need to have special permission to cultivate these plants. And so I highlighted two examples. One is the water hyacinth, which we'll talk about in a little bit more depth later on. But the other one is the Brazilian pepper plant. And I wanted to see, have you guys seen the Brazilian pepper plant before? You don't know? It's that pepper plant right there. It's green, it has the red little berries on them. And they were actually brought over from Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil. And they have that Christmassy, very winter holiday color. So they look very much like holly. They have those green leaves, they're red, they're very ornamental and pretty. But they're actually related to plants like the poison sumac, poison ivy, and the poison oak. So they can cause skin irritations. If you inhale them, you might actually get some irritation respiratory-wise. But they're an invasive species and they can take over hammock lands, pine lands, and even mangrove territories. These plants can actually grow up to 30 feet tall and they can live for about 30 years or so. And I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit more because Brazilian pepper plants have been found here in Cedar Key.
Yeah.
Bird's eye peppers.
So when you go down State Road 24 and you think you're looking at mangroves, look twice because they might be Brazilian peppers. They kind of blend in, especially if they don't have the berries on them. And yeah, there's quite a few around the island. No, I think they've pretty well kept them. And I wanted to ask you, do you know what the word invasive means, right?
Yeah, whenever something crowds out their species.
Yeah, okay.
All right, good. So we have what we call pepper busters. They're found actually throughout Florida and they're groups of gardeners. You can be master gardeners, gardening clubs. You can just be a regular resident and they have pepper busting days where they go out and they manually remove these pepper plants from the systems. You've done, can you talk a little bit about what that experience was like?
It's a lot of hard work. With Fish and Wildlife, we had to do some work with it. We didn't really do too much, but it was just hard work.
So what exactly did you do when you were out there?
We did kind of a little bit of everything. Manual pulling, we did some trimming and some spraying.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, you can actually join the Cedar Key Pepper Busters right here. Mm-hmm.
Well, there's Andrew Good, too.
I didn't even know this.
Yeah.
Yep, so this is a class 1 species. We also have the class 2 plants, and these are plants that can be cultured in aquatic plant nurseries and exported out of state, but you need to have the Division of Plant Industry approval. So one of the examples here is the water lettuce. And there's a little contingency on how they actually got here in Florida. Some believe it's a native species, but they're not actually quite sure if it's native or a non-native plant. But what we do know is that it's been here since the 1760s. And can you guess any types of problems we might have with water lettuce based off this picture? Okay, so let's think. If you're a boater and you want to go fishing one day and you put your boat in and you have to go through this. You might want an airboat. But if you don't have an airboat, you might be very unhappy. So this lettuce can actually take over, it proliferates, and it'll cover lakes, ponds, and it makes it very difficult for transportation, for boats to get through. It clogs dams, it clogs rivers. And then it also has environmental effects. So it's covering the whole surface, which means that oxygen isn't able to exchange between the air and the water. When you also have this coverage, sunlight can't come through. So if you have any plants that were growing on the bottom, they're no longer getting that sunlight to grow. So now you have plants dying. And so that's something to think about. And so it is listed as a US federal noxious weed list. But right now it's actually considered a maintenance control issue within Florida. So Florida does have a program where they go out and they remove aquatic weeds and they make sure that they're not proliferating in lakes and rivers. But that means they're constantly on the lookout for these plants to be in those areas.
Yeah, I go fishing and I'll see, I can see that sometimes. I don't know, I never really got too close to look at it.
To water, yeah.
Do they come like the bigger pumps? Do they come in the springs? That's duckweed. No, like the
Duckweed's very small.
Duckweed's small. So water lettuce looks very similar to regular lettuce.
Yeah,
But these are really great questions for Brandon as well.
I went to a camp last year at Blue Springs,
Right.
and we did a lot of photography and stuff
Mhm.
on the edge of the walk south. Pretty sure we've seen it.
You saw those? Very
All right,
interesting.
say that for Brandon.
Yeah, we'll ask that to Brandon
If
as
he knows
well.
if it comes this far north.
So one of the uses for freshwater plants is food. And so I have two examples of aquacrops, which are water chestnut and watercress. Have any of you guys ever eaten these plants before? Watercress, yeah. So watercress can be used as a garnish or it can be used in salads. They say it tastes a lot like arugula. It has a very zesty flavor. It can be found here in Florida, and they actually do cultivate it. So what I was reading is that what they do is they dig about 6 inches into the ground, and then they'll actually line that before adding peat moss and soil. And you can either take seeds and spread them out, or you can use cuttings as well. But when you take the seeds, you do what you would typically do in your own garden. You would rake them in, you would water them, you keep them a little bit moist. And then once that seedling sprouts, they start introducing water. So they slowly rise up the water until it's fully submerged. And this process takes about 3 weeks till they're ready to harvest. And again, they have that zesty flavor and can be used in salads. So yeah, that's awesome that you're eating watercress. What did you think of it?
Tastes like arugula.
Tastes like arugula?
It's exactly like arugula.
Good. That's
Did
awesome.
Dad use it in the restaurant?
No, I've had it really nice restaurants as garnish.
Okay, yeah. And so this is more some photos of watercress. So again, it is used in salads, but it's a great source of vitamin A and C, niacin, thiamine, iron. It adds that zesty flavor, and it's actually grown in Central Florida. Another use for freshwater plants is fodder. Do you guys know what fodder is? Any ideas? So fodder is plant cuttings, and they use this to feed domesticated livestock animals. So we're talking cattle, horses, chickens, pigs. One of the things you might always think of is, what do you feed horses? Hay. So you can actually use aquatic plants to feed these animals as well. And so we're going to talk about water hyacinth in a little bit more depth, but small duckweed, which is what you're talking about, is cultivated, used as fodder. And you can actually, some people have said they've eaten it, and it tastes very similar to sweet cabbage. So going back to that food source.
So it doesn't taste like ducks.
It doesn't taste like ducks, unfortunately.
You have to do so much, like so much that to get enough to feed a horse.
It gets
Okay.
very thick.
I've never really seen it like, I've only seen it about like that.
Yeah.
I've seen it cover so much.
So we'll go back to water hyacinth, and it was actually introduced in New Orleans in 1884 at a plant exposition. It's considered a nuisance invasive plant all over the world. It has these very pretty flowers, but you can see in the right picture that it can proliferate and take over waterways. Here in Florida, it took about 70 years for it to reach us and then overgrow, where it took up 126,000 acres of waterways. So that's a lot. It's covered. And it costs a lot of money to remove it and to manage it. So Florida has had the aquatic weeds. People go out, they manage this. You can do it mechanically, you can do it with chemicals. So there's a number of ways to remove water hyacinth. And right now it's under the maintenance control. It's not native. So here in Florida, we consider it a noxious species. And do you guys remember what class it was? Class 1 or class 2? Class 1. Yep, so it is a class 1 species. And that's again because it can block these waterways, limiting boat traffic, recreational use. It can be light limiting, so it doesn't allow other plants to grow underneath it. But here in Florida, we can cultivate it here in nurseries. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the permitting, but one of the reasons why is you can export this plant. And we might export it to places like Canada, which are cooler in climate, which means that the plant isn't temperature tolerant. It's not able to withstand those colder temperatures. So in the summertime, you can have them in water gardens. They look very pretty, again, with these flowers. But in the winter time, because it gets so cold, they'll die back. And so if you want to grow them here in Florida, there's a couple different things you have to do. Again, it is a class 1 under FDACS, which means that you'll have to register as a nursery with the Division of Plant Industry. You're going to have to apply for a collection permit, which allows you to collect those hyacinth. You'll actually have to show that your building doesn't allow for it to spread, so you'll have to have precautions put in place in your nursery. And then you'll have to request and submit a compliance agreement with the Water Hyacinth Division. And this allows you to export it out of state. So you do need a federal permit as well. There are 2 divisions, remember? So we have FDACS, which is the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. And then the 2 divisions that monitor are the, we can go back real quick. Division of Aquaculture and the Division of Plant Industry, the DPI. And so a lot of the permitting goes through that DPI. That way you can see that. Okay, so another reason we culture plants are for aquarium plants and ornamentals. So again, water hyacinth is an ornamental type of plant. Here, you wanna have them for water gardens. And so water gardens are constructed ponds that are done for aesthetic purposes. So they add value to your home area or your landscape because they have that pretty look to them. They're very beautiful. You have the beautiful plants and they're very eye-catching. And so that's why you have the aquatic gardens and you might be growing things like yellow water lily. We'll also talk about some aquarium species as well, like the common water weed. And so those can add oxygen to your aquariums. They can add habitat as well for the different fish that are living there. And they can also be aesthetically pleasing when you're adding them to your aquariums. We're going to talk a little bit more about yellow water lily. I'm sure Brandon will go over this a little bit more in depth as well. But there are so many varieties of aquatic plants used for aquariums and water garden purposes. In fact, they believe there's over 200 different varieties. For water lilies, they can make them in different colors. So it's called hybridizing, and you can choose different things that you like about a different water lily and sort of genetically breed them to the plant that you're looking for. So if you're looking for a specific color maybe, or you're looking for a specific petal size. And so one of the things they might do is they'll look for flowering plants. And typically if a plant is flowering on the first day and they're looking for it to be the female, they'll take it and they'll remove the stamen. And so the stamen is the male part of that flower. So now this plant is just a female flower. They'll also look for a second or third day flower. So they'll look for them at the same time, but the second or third day flowers, they're gonna be looking for the male parts. So they're gonna take the stamen and look at the anthers. And the anthers, if you're looking at the picture here, are going to be holding all of that pollen. So they'll actually remove the anther from the male plant, and then they'll drop it into the stigma of the female plant. They'll then close the flower and they'll usually cover it with a cheesecloth or something to hold it in place. So you can see that in the bottom picture there where it's covered in cheesecloth so that the pollen stays in place and it allows it to fertilize.
Do they do this like while it's still in water?
They can do this in the water. Brandon might go into a little bit more depth about this.
Yeah, because his family's business, one of their things that they're known for is their various varieties of water lilies that they actually breed. So that's a good question.
Yeah.
Brandon.
So they'll wait for the seed to form, they'll get the pods to develop, and eventually it'll come into the flower that they're looking for. So yeah, we'll talk to Brandon a little bit more about this too. Some other aquatic plants that are used for aquarium purposes are Elodea, and then we have fanwort. And so these are great plants for aquarium tanks, so your freshwater tanks, because they allow a lot of habitat. They actually grow up into the tank, and you can actually get these different forms. So you can get them where they have a bulb attached to them. You can get them as a separate clump. You can even get potted plants as well for your aquariums. And again, these add oxygen to the water and extra habitat. We also use plants for wetland restoration. So have you guys ever been involved in any of the wetland restoration type projects? Okay, so that might be something you might be interested in. But here in Florida, there are laws put in place, and it's because of human impact. So we as humans have impacted our wetlands and our coasts through the way that we've used them. And laws are there and require restoration of these damaged wetlands. And so that opens up a huge aquatic plant sector. So now you're not just growing for ornamental purposes or food, but you're growing for restoration purposes. And so we have a couple different plants here. We have duck potato here. And the reason it actually gets its name duck potato is because potatoes grow in the ground, right? They have those giant nodules. Duck potato has that pretty flower, but underneath its roots sometimes form what they call corms, and they look very similar to the potato as well. So that's how it became duck potato. Here we have a picture of salt rush, and it actually provides food for nesting birds and other wildlife. And then here we have coontail, which is not a rooting plant. It actually is a floating plant, and so that can provide habitat for some fish species as well.
Would like sea oats be one? Like for like, I know they use platoons.
So these are just a few examples of the many, many plants that are used for wetland restoration.
These are primarily freshwater plants. So now you're going into saltwater plants for restoration, and you have many species that are being cultured here in Florida for that. And sea oats is one of them.
And then we have emerging uses of freshwater plants. And some of those are for bioremediation. Do you guys know what bioremediation is? Any guesses?
I've heard what you probably say.
Any guesses on or remembering anything about it? Bioremediation. So let's break the word apart. Bio, it means living, right? And what's it mean to remediate something? Never, okay. So that means to actually make something better. So for when you're remediating something, they'll actually take living organisms. A lot of times you'll hear them take like bacteria. You can take different animals, even oysters could be considered bioremediators. And they use them to control pollutants. So these organisms actually take them out. So that's what bioremediation is. And so some of the examples we have are nutrients and heavy metals. So for nutrients, they can uptake nitrogen and phosphorus, right? Because plants usually uptake those as their nutrients for growth. And so that comes from our wastewater treatment areas. It can come off from fertilizer, things of that nature. We also have CO2 scrubbers. And so what do plants provide humans other than food? And what do we provide plants? Exactly. So they're using up that CO2, which can control climate change as well. Another thing is biofuel. So biofuel is definitely an emerging technology that they're really researching. And the idea is that you're able to take these plants and turn them into fuels. You can use freshwater plants. A lot of research is also done on saltwater plants as well. I'm looking at different algae species too. And that's because they have what we call hydrocarbons. They create a lot of hydrocarbons, and that's what we use to make fuel. You can also use them for aquaponics. So I know you guys have a system. How's that going?
We have like
One mangrove.
Mr. Powers was doing it way before I was in grade. So
Okay.
A bunch of red mangroves. They all did really well. They even lived through the winter.
I thought, they did well. I thought you just had that one in there that got too tall and we had to go
Relocate.
Yeah, I think he took them all out. So
Okay. So what is aquaponics?
It's growing a plant like a recirculating system.
Okay.
the plants filter the water so the fish basically provide plants food, and the plants filter the water for the fish.
Mm-hmm. Yes, correct. So with the fish, it becomes aquaponics. And so what kind of fish were you guys using?
We
Tilapia.
had goldfish on the outside one.
Goldfish on the outside one?
These goldfish are like 4 years old. I don't know if they're still alive. We had an armored catfish in there sometime too.
Mm-hmm. So UF actually has a couple different facilities where they're growing things like Swiss chard and red lettuce. And I remember when I visited your facilities, I saw tons and tons of basil.
Yeah, we did lettuce, basil.
He was gonna set up a recirculating system on the table.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're gonna do with our tilapia
Yeah, but it got too late school year to do it.
next year.
Next year. Yeah, so you can use it next year. You'll use the fish, you'll use the different plants. Are you guys looking at growing anything else?
Well, he wants to try a lot of stuff this year.
Yeah,
We're gonna do like a floating rocks.
Mm-hmm. And what are some of the things that you liked or didn't like about your systems? Because we talked a little bit about recirculating systems earlier. And so that is a recirculating system that you're using with the plants and the fish.
I know the outside one is gonna be different than the inside one. The inside one, he wants to try some new things.
I don't know. I don't have any problems with it. I don't think.
Okay, you'll have to keep us posted.
Mr. Powers is the expert on that.
We're rebuilding the outside one. We started that.
Mm-hmm.
We're just taking it all apart, cleaning it, and then rebuilding it.
So we do have a couple handouts for you guys as well. You'll actually find this one. It's the Aquatic Plant Aquaculture Rules and Regulations. We just did a brief overview of them, but this will help you guys remember that as well.
Now, I want to talk about one other group. So Natalie introduced you to a lot of the
uses of aquatic plants, but it was all freshwater based. So what can you think of from a saltwater base that may not be here in Florida though? Where would you be using plants in a saltwater application for cultivating? Well, yeah, we talked about that. Yeah, you're right. For restoration purposes, there are folks that are mangroves and actually are salt marsh plants that you take advantage, and you look out here and you see. Well, I'm not so sure that actually I would consider that an aquaculture application. But where would you be? Think about maybe some other marine plants that would be grown in saltwater and why. Maybe, again, maybe not here in Florida, so you may not be exposed to that. But seaweeds, various seaweeds, nori, you know what nori is, you use for sushi and so forth. That's a big industry up in Maine. Those are more cold tolerant macroalgae, and they are actually support a very important aquaculture industry in that part of the country. Now, globally, we learned at, I think, our last session, if either you were here, who was the major producer worldwide in terms of aquaculture? What country would lead the pack? Take a big guess. Who would? Oh no, we're way down there. It's China. China is big, and one of their big production items is seaweed. Seaweed, not just for food, but for pharmaceuticals used for agar and so forth.
So agar is, you can actually find it in foods. It's like a gelatin type base to it, so it allows foods to stick together. You can actually find it in things like toothpaste as well. Cosmetics is a
Big
huge
use.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can actually find some of this stuff ground up in your dog's food. So they use plants for many, many applications. We just covered a handful of them.
All right. So if you do you all need to take a quick break? We have some waters over there in the coolers. If okay, you're fine. All right. So let's see who we have with us on Zoom. And there's Brandon McLean waiting on us. Brandon, can you hear us? All right, because. All right, Brandon, you're muted and Natalie's unmuting you. That is a big greenhouse, isn't it? Brandon?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Oh, I hear you great. We hear you loud and clear. And they just commented on that big greenhouse that you're standing in front of.
This is a small piece of it. This is just one of the bays. Are you ready for me to begin?
Sure. I just briefly introduced you, and the third generation farmer. Actually, one of our students here, he works with his dad, so he, I guess, second generation clam farmer. But your grandfather started this business well over, I believe, 60 years ago now, correct?
That is correct. Yeah, my grandfather started the business. It was over 60 years ago, and at the time, most of the plants in Florida were wild collected, and because of that, there was a lot of issues with supply. There's also a lot of issues with quality, and so he saw a niche that I could start this business and be able to get good quality plants and good supply to my customers on a regular basis. And lo and behold, 60 years later, we're still in business, and I'm the third generation. My father really took over the business and built it to what it is today, and now it's my goal to keep it going and expanding and drive it into the next century and update our technology and move forward. What you can see behind me is one of our greenhouses here, and this is a recirculating system set up. And behind me, we're growing all plants for production. These are freshwater aquarium plants. The main part of our business is growing for freshwater aquarium ornamental industry. And our main customers are going to be people like PetSmart, Petco, Pet Supermarket, the big chain stores. Also, the independent stores are really where you get your best selection, but there's not as many of those by volume as there are of the big chain stores. So our main volume ends up in chain stores, and that's our main customers. We also, in addition, and we'll stop out there later, but we grow water garden plants for the ornamental trade of water gardens. We do a lot of water lilies and other marginal plants. But for now, we're going to talk about these plants behind us here. So this is bare root production table of Echinodorus parviflorus tropica, which commonly is referred to as the rosette sort. And what we're looking for is a good sized plant with a variety of leaves, and we're also looking for a good root system. So in order to help grow the root system, we grow the peat moss, but it's floating and recirculating. There's water running through the whole table and recirculating system. Peat moss is just used as a rooting media to give some stability to the plants and help retain nutrients. To produce a sellable plant, we clean off the lower leaves, which could be yellow or damaged, and then we'll end up with something in the neighborhood of this. This would be a medium to large plant, and we'd wash off the soil, get a nice white root system, and this would be a sellable rosette sort. for production on a lot of these plants, one of their neat aspects that they have is they produce these nice long bloom stalks. And on the bloom stalks, you actually get a baby plantlet. So these plantlets here, I'll try to hold it up a little bit closer so you can see already a newly formed plant. And what we do is just stick them into the peat moss covering the base, and we're able to do our production on these sword plant varieties with the plantlets. So let me grab the camera here, and we're going to move over to one of our greenhouses. Before we kind of an idea the scope of this greenhouse.
Hey, Brandon, I know you're moving, but if you're talking and moving, we can't hear the audio.
Over here.
You went black.
And hold 14,000 plants, depending on the variety.
So what does he need to do?
He needs to rejoin the group from his phone.
So he can't hear us. You know that's.
You're gonna go out to go out this door and walk straight.
All right, so that's one thing we need to do is be able.
Hey.
All right, we lost you for a little bit, Brandon.
Okay, I just switched to my computer here.
Okay.
So unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to see the pretty pictures, but I can continue to tell you about the nursery. What you saw there was one of our greenhouses, and it's everything is recirculating system there. And I think when I lost you, I was trying to tell you the volume of plants that fit in one table. So the tables are approximately 5 feet by 100 feet. And in one table, we fit between 7,000 and 13,000 plants. So the volume is very high for each table. And in that greenhouse in particular, there's 30 tables. Right on the other side where I was trying to walk was where our potted plant production is. And we also have 40 tables in that greenhouse. So when you think of the volume of what we do in aquatic plants, it's quite large. And on a weekly basis, our number one most popular plant is the Amazon sword plant. And we'll sell in the neighborhood of 6,000 of those in one single week. It takes between 12 and 15 weeks to get them up to size. And in the wintertime, it takes closer to 20 to 30 weeks to get them up to sellable size. What I can do in a few minutes is
Where are all these plants going to? Again,
Yeah, these plants are going to the retail trade, and our biggest customers in the retail trade are the chain stores. So you can find our plants in places like Petco and PetSmart, which are big national chains. A smaller regional chain would be Pet Supermarket, which is still pretty large size, but in a more regional area throughout the southern states. And then we also end up in Walmarts and other large chains throughout the U.S. But we also send a fair amount to Canada too. So you can find our plants mostly in North America. The independent retail stores carry the best selections. The chain stores carry the most by volume. Did that answer the question?
Thank you, Brandon. And then
Okay.
were you listening in to Natalie giving an overview of some of the different freshwater plants and how they're used for cultivation?
I was. I can tell you a little bit more about the nursery, and then do you guys want to ask the questions at that point?
And I think they're very interested to learn more. At least I am, because I know you're also a big breeder of some of the ornamental plants, particularly water hyacinths. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that as well.
Sure. Just before I pass on,
I said that wrong. I meant to say water lilies. I didn't mean to say water hyacinths.
I knew what you meant. I was going to let you roll with that one. So before I move on to the water lilies and the ornamental thing, because that's kind of like a second part of our business, let me just finish up the aquarium. What you guys saw was mostly immersed production in hydroponic tables. And you might go, wow, how do you sell aquarium plants if they're not grown underwater? They actually ship better, and we're able to get a plant to market faster by growing it out of the water. But for a lot of the varieties, you can't grow them out of water, or they're much prettier growing underwater. So we do have big areas of underwater production that I was hoping to be able to show you, but on the cell phone when I walked, we lost reception. So there are large areas outside, and they're grown in vats underwater. They're approximately 8 feet by 14 feet, and the water depth is in the neighborhood of 16 inches for those. So we do have a big area of underwater production. We'll talk about the water garden plants at this point. So the water garden industry is different from the regular aquarium plant industry in that it's more seasonal, like the regular nursery business. So March, April, May, and June are your sales months. The rest of the year is more geared for production or cleanup. Water lilies, we grow over 200 different varieties at this point for sale. And marginal plants, we grow about 100 different varieties of plants for sale. We grow both tropical and hardy water lilies. The hardy water lilies are mainly sold up north. The tropical water lilies are more treated like annuals. So we'll sell a fair amount of those up north, but they're only good for that season. They're a lot showier. They have a lot more flowers per plant and a lot more colorful blooms than a lot of the hardy varieties. We also hybridize a bunch of different tropical water lily varieties, and we've been doing this for years. And the goal behind hybridizing is to bring different colors or different traits to the market. So we developed a very red color for the tropicals, and that was developed by Florida Aquatic Nurseries. And we've won many awards for our tropical water lilies in this color range. We've also developed a very deep purple color and won many awards for those. In fact, I think out of the past 10 years, we've won Best New Tropical Water Lilies 9 years. So our hybridizing has been pretty state of the art for the industry, and these are from international contests, and that's where we receive the awards. We also received a patent about a year ago for one of our hardy water lilies. And it was really unique because we were able to use a tropical water lily and cross it with a hardy water lily. So we were able to bring a purple flower onto a hardy water lily plant. And this is something that really hadn't been done in the industry. It had only been done by 1 or 2 people overseas. And so we were one of the first ones to get it in commercial production here in the United States. And the particular plant that we hybridized was named Purple Fantasy, and I received a patent for that plant, so it's protected. And the sales have been pretty good. The market's really enjoyed it, so I think it was a good introduction to the industry. We'll continue to work bringing colors, different colors to the hardy water lily range, doing this method in the future.
So one of the questions from the student, Pete, is what are the typical colors that you might find from a wild water lily?
So wild water lilies, there's many different species throughout the world. You have white ones, you have yellow ones, blue ones, pink ones, and then mixing those colors, you've ended up with what you have today. So I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Okay, another question. Is there any co-dominance with any of the colors?
The dominance, so they've been hybridized for a long time, and a lot of the dominance has kind of been hybridized out of it. But in some ways, if you imagine a color palette, you're able to blend the colors similar to like what an artist does. So to get the deep purples, we continue to cross reds with the purple color, the bluish purple color that was already out there. And over years of doing this, we ended up with darker and darker purples. To get the red, you would breed pinks together and select the most red one out of there and continue to cross it with each other. And that's how we ended up with the red color.
So in the presentation earlier, we noticed a drop in the value of sales from the 2 Florida aquaculture surveys conducted. One was, I think, the 2005 survey results, and then the last one was 2012. And we saw a drop in production. You want to comment to that?
So the industry is definitely downsized. I mean, part of that, you had the economic crash and recession, so that put a lot of small businesses out of business. But even the industry in Florida has changed. What I don't see, our primary business is the aquarium plants, and I don't see a lot of new people getting into the aquarium hobby. What I do see is that the ones that are in the hobby are getting a lot better at using plants and creating these beautiful aquascapes. And if you go look online, the contests in there, you can really see that using plants is a lot more popular around the world at this point. I don't believe that the industry for the future is going to be a growing industry because of less people using fish tanks nowadays. But I do believe it's stable enough to be in business for many years to come.
You guys have any other questions for Brandon?
Not even on the water lettuce.
So another question they had in the presentation earlier was they were talking about water lettuce, and they wanted to know if they were seeing that in some of our lakes up here. Would it be up this far north, or is that more central South Florida?
No, I think water lettuce you can even see up into like Georgia, Louisiana, and some of the southern states there. Texas also. Similar areas to where you see the water hyacinth, you'll be able to see water lettuce.
Right. Well, we see water hyacinths quite a bit. In fact, we saw some recently when we had a lot of northwest winds blow the Swanee River discharge down our way. And we always know it gets fresh when you see a few errant water hyacinth plants floating around on your clam leases. Not a good sign, by the way.
No, that would not be good for growing clams.
So I just think maybe to wrap it up, but since we weren't able to see more of your production, if you just want to give a quick kind of overview of this, the first thing they saw was that big greenhouse behind you, and that was really, they commented on that, maybe to the overall scope or scale of your business there and where you're located.
Sure. So we're in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, the western part, which is Davie, if you know the area. We've got 15 total acres, and we have about 5 acres under greenhouse production. The rest is outdoor production areas, and we're pretty maxed out for space. Now, in the greenhouse areas, we do the recirculating systems, and it's hydroponically grown. In the outdoor areas, they're kind of a flow-through system where they're underwater, and that's also where the water lilies and the marginal plants are grown in the outdoor areas. We have a total of 43 employees right now currently. It gets a little bigger in the season, but it's a very labor-intensive business. Because of that, we've had a good staff with us, and most of our members have been here close to 10 years, some more, some a little less, but we have a good percentage of them that get to go to our 10-year lunch every year.
Now, we did speak a little bit about the water hyacinth and the fact that they were able to export that in spite of it being such an invasive species here. Are you culturing any of those for export?
We do. Water hyacinth is still one of the most popular water garden plants. It's not winter hardy in the northern states. So most of the northern states allow it for production, and that's where most of the water garden industry is, in our northern states. We're also able to sell a fair amount to Canada. A few years ago, we were able to get the laws changed in Florida, where we're finally allow it to sell it in the U.S. Many of the other states had been able to sell it in the U.S. It was just a particular Florida law that didn't allow it to be sold in the U.S. But we were able to get that changed, so now we're able to sell it throughout the U.S. But each state is in charge of regulating their own plant list. So that is one of the things that makes it very difficult, but it's also one of the things that I think is very important because we cover so many different climate ranges throughout the U.S. that each state has the ability to say, hey, this plant will not overwinter here, or it will overwinter here, and we're going to put it on our invasive list. But it's a very easy plant to grow, and by volume, it's one of our largest selling water garden plants.
So when you pack out maybe once a week to ship to your distributors and big box stores? What kind, I mean, I imagine that must be just an amazing day.
That's a great question. We actually pack out every single day, Monday
Whoa,
through
okay,
Friday.
never mind.
And we go to the airport twice a day. Most of it's air freight that we sell because the plants are pretty sensitive. So most of it's done by air freight. And we make a morning airport run and drop off half of our customers. And we also make an afternoon, evening airport run and drop off the second half of the customers for the day. In addition, we sell via FedEx and UPS for people that are closer and able to get plants in a timely fashion that's not too expensive through those services. So the aquarium plant business is year-round, Monday through Friday, every day of the week, which is very great. It's nice and stable, and we're able to keep a workforce to do so. The water garden business is just those 4 months of spring, and that makes it more difficult because we have to hire in seasonal staff that's not as well trained to be able to hit the volume there.
That's amazing. That's the number of employees you have. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. I don't know if we have any other questions from the two fellows that are here.
Okay.
I really do appreciate your time, Brandon. Sorry we couldn't see the rest of the tour, but
Yeah.
I appreciate your time, and they know where your website's located, and they can look at some of the very prettiest varieties of aquatic plants that you produce.
Okay. Well, yeah, I'm sorry I didn't get the tour to work out. I was practicing with it, and I thought it would work a little better than that. But at least you got to see part of the nursery. And
All right.
check out the website, and you can see the different varieties of plants we grow in more detail.
All right. Thank you so much. And the fellows are thanking you as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.